work because I had had this experience of the people with whom I shared this experience of transformation, that they wanted to take responsibility for making a contribution to making the world work. So as kind of an assist to them, I began to take a look at what it would take to make the world work. And as I said, when I did that, I came face to face with and really couldn't get past the facts of hunger and starvation. And so I began to make a study to actually examine and study the field of hunger and starvation. And if you were to do that, and it took me about 3 years to do it, if you were to do that, you'd have to read a pile of papers about that high. Reports and research papers and articles and opinions. You'd have to read a stack of papers about that high. And in addition to that, you'd have to read a stack of books probably about that high. Books on hunger and starvation and agriculture, on economics and sociology, on politics, etc. And when you were done, or while you were doing that perhaps, you would need to talk to not less than 4 experts around the world. If you were really going to study hunger and starvation and its solutions, you'd have to talk to at least 4 experts around the world for probably not less than 4, let's say 5 hours per expert about hunger and starvation, in addition to the papers and the books. And the last thing you'd need to complete your education is that you'd have to go out and observe hunger for yourself firsthand. You'd have to go out into the field to probably not less than 2 countries. Now, we don't have 3 years tonight. We're going to devote the next hour to a 3-year education. And I'm going to tell you it's going to be damn difficult because you've got an enormous amount of ground to cover in a very little bit of time. And some of you, and perhaps most of you, by the time the next hour is over, are just going to feel like you've gotten battered into your seat somewhat. Like what was really going on here tonight was some kind of a contest, and you were losing. So we're going to spend the next hour really taking a look at the facts and figures and the solutions and the ideas and the opinions and the points of view and the statistics, and take a look at some pictures so that you can get some, perhaps a little bit of a sense of a first-hand experience of starvation and the solutions and the problem and the mess of it all. See, an hour from now, I'd like you to be buried in the problem and confusion and conflict covering starvation and hunger around the world. And I promise you it will be damn hard work. By now you should be kind of a little heavier in the seat. If you feel a little heavier in the seat, and if you're a little kind of confused perhaps, and there's one thought going through one side of your brain being argued with by another thought on the other side of your brain, then you're probably about where you ought to be with respect to the problem of hunger and starvation on the planet. Where you should be at the moment is stuck in the middle of the problem. Actually, if you are very awake tonight, by now you are stuck deeply in the problem, and if you're not so awake, perhaps you're just stuck in the unconsciousness of it. What I'd like to do is I'd like to represent the problem as a sphere. I'd like to take all of the facts and all of the figures and all of the statistics and all of the opinions and all of the ideas and all of the solutions and all of the things that you've just seen and heard, and I'd like to represent them by a great big sphere, you know, that has a surface and a lot of inside to it. Now, in the normal course of events, because we're all so bright and because we're all so logical and so powerful in our intellects, we all think that it's sensible to start at the beginning of the problem. So I'd like to be clear with you tonight that we are not going to start at the beginning of the problem, because you and I are not at the beginning of the problem. We are in the middle of the problem. So instead of starting at the beginning, what we're going to do tonight is we're going to start at the start of the problem, down inside in the middle of the problem, stuck in the middle of the problem. You see, where we are, listen, where we are with respect to hunger and starvation on the planet is that what we do doesn't work. You see, what we do to end hunger and starvation on the planet, which includes, by the way, what we don't do, in that set of what we do is included what we don't do, and what we do, including what we don't do, doesn't work to end hunger and starvation on the planet. And that's where I want to start. I want to start down in the middle of the problem where what we're doing doesn't work. Now, interestingly enough, there isn't a person in the room who doesn't know from their own personal experience, from their own life, what to do when what they're doing doesn't work. You see, everybody knows what to do when what they're doing doesn't work. And it's interesting because every time I'm interviewed about the problem of hunger and starvation, the interviewer will say, well, what are you going to do? You see, when what we do doesn't work, what we then do is to do more of it. And if that doesn't work, then we do it better. And when that doesn't work, then we do it different. And when none of those things work, we then repeat the cycle all over again, and we do more, and we do better, and we do different. And when that doesn't work, we repeat the same cycle all over again. And no one ever notices that what we're doing that doesn't work is the more, better, and different that we did to answer the fact that what we did before didn't work. Now, you see, if you have the arrogance to think that you can start at the beginning of a problem, you never notice that what you do doesn't work. And what's more important, you never notice that what you do about what doesn't work doesn't work. So where I'd like to start tonight is to get clear, for you and I to get clear that what we do to end hunger and starvation on this planet doesn't work. And what we do about the fact that what we do doesn't work either. Now, when you start to get clear about that, when that starts to become clear to you, when you really get into the stuff that you saw this evening and the things that Professor Prosterman told you, when you really embed yourself in the heart of the problem, and you don't try the arrogance of thinking that you can get out here to the surface of the globe, you know you're stuck in the middle of it. When you know where you are, what you can see clearly is that you are in a condition of frustration and hopelessness. Now, it took me 3 years to study the things that you heard tonight in an hour. It took me 3 years. And as I studied more and more and more, I began to get more and more hopeless. Because I could see that the situation, and you by now should be able to see just from what you've heard in an hour, that the situation is a mass of confusion, of controversy, of doubt, of uncertainty, of conflict, of opinionization, of evaluation and judgment. You see, from this presentation, you should now be confused. If you are awake, you are confused. If you're awake, you feel heavy. Now, in the normal course of events, what we think is we ought to do something. You know, when I'm interviewed, they say, well, what are you going to do that the Congress can't do? What are you going to do that the UN isn't doing? What do you got that's new? What do you got that's better? What more are you going to come up with? And nobody ever notices that the answer to those questions only adds to the confusion and the controversy, only adds to the conflict, only adds to the opinionization. It only adds to the hopelessness and the frustration. So the first thing we're going to do tonight in this presentation, what the beginning of the Hunger Project is about, is not doing something. So we're going to start off by not doing something. Because let me tell you what it is when you do something. Listen, when you do something in a situation which is hopeless, what you are doing is experienced by yourself as a gesture. See, when I interact with something that's bigger than I am, that's too big for me to handle, when I interact with something about which I feel small and insignificant and helpless, when I interact with something at which I am at effect, then I interact with that thing with gestures. So in the normal course of events, when you and I hear about a problem like hunger and starvation on the planet, a problem which represents really all of the major problems which afflict the condition in which we live, when we hear about a problem like that, the way we usually relate to it is with a gesture. We try to do something about it, and we know that what we do won't make any difference. Not really. So we get ourselves off the hook by, quote, doing our part. So let's get clear that the Hunger Project is not a better solution. It isn't a different solution. It isn't doing more. It isn't another good idea about how hunger ought to be ended on the planet. We are not going to be reduced to making a gesture. It's very useful, however, to get very clear with yourself about the sense of frustration with respect to a problem like hunger and starvation. It's very useful to get in touch with your own hopelessness about the fact that 15 million of us die each year in the space in which we live. Every year as I studied more about hunger and starvation and became more hopeless and more frustrated, I became closer and closer to making a gesture and to asking my friends to join with me in the gesture. The problem was hopeless. It was too enormous. It was too confused. There was too much controversy, too much conflict. I mean, the whole problem was covered over with this kind of thick pea soup which couldn't be penetrated. And on top of the pea soup was my own frustration and hopelessness. And the more I learned, the thicker it got. And I kept getting closer and closer to making a gesture. And I want you to know that I'm fundamentally opposed to gestures. I consider them to be dehumanizing. A gesture is a statement that says, you don't matter. You don't count. You can't have an impact. Who you are doesn't really make a difference. But when the problem is bigger than you are, and there really isn't anything you can do, and when the problem's too horrible to ignore, then perhaps one is reduced to a gesture. And when one is, one has begun to erode one's own dignity, one's own humanity, and truly begun to erode the humanity of all of us. You see, I want you to be clear that I got clear about the fact that my opinion only added to the controversy, only added to the confusion. So tonight we're going to start not out here on the surface at the source of the problem, you see. we're not going to start out here on the surface of the problem. We're going to start right down in the middle of the problem. We're not going to start at the beginning. We're going to start at the start. And it's very interesting. Every time I get myself to the start of something, I always find the same thing there. In every problem, when I've gotten to the start of it, I have found me. So we're going to start out this evening. We are going to start out to find the laws by which hunger and starvation persist. You see, it's first off, we got to get clear that it isn't what we do or don't do. Get clear that it isn't what you do or don't do. It isn't that we lack a good idea. That is not why hunger and starvation persist. What we've done about starvation does not end starvation. The truth is that all of the work done to eliminate starvation in the world is done within a particular condition. And it is this condition, not what is done or not done, which causes hunger and starvation to persist. What we want to do tonight is we want to get down underneath the pea soup and locate the very laws of the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet. And to start to do that, I have to start with me. You see, I am the examining entity. Now, any physicist knows that the observer has to be included in the equation to come out with the truth. So we're going to take a look at the observer first. See, I want to see what a me is in relation to hunger and starvation. When I talk about the me you are, I say you. But it's really a me. I want to know what is a me in relation to hunger and starvation. Not what do I think. Not what is my opinion. I don't care what you think or what your opinion is. We've already discovered that only adds to the pea soup. I want to discover what is our unconscious and unexamined system of beliefs with respect to hunger and starvation. Not what I think, not what my point of view is, not what my opinion is, but the structure in which my opinion is molded, the limits of what I think, the structure in which my thoughts and my views and my opinions and my perceptions are formed. So what I want to discover is what's true about the unconscious and unexamined structure of beliefs that you and I have about hunger and starvation on the planet. Not what do I think, not what is my opinion. When you begin to examine yourself, and by the way, we could sit here and we could talk together, and in a very, very short period of time, we would come up with it together. We're going to move a little bit more rapidly than that tonight because, as I say, I've been through this path. I've cut down some of the weeds, and I can kind of move us along a little bit more rapidly. But it's really your work. We're working together. So you're going to be looking inside yourself for your own personal, unconscious structure of beliefs about hunger and starvation. And I think that when you begin to look, one of the very first things you come up against is this belief in scarcity. See, human beings believe in scarcity. It's not that they think that something is scarce, it's that they think in a structure of scarcity. So, for instance, we all know that love is very scarce, don't we? I mean, it's precious. If you have any love, you've got to hand it out just a little bit to each person. Don't give anybody too much. And only the right people should get it, right? Don't love everybody. Oh, no, it's too precious. It's too scarce. Love is scarce. And time is very scarce, isn't it? Probably nobody in the room with enough time. See, time is scarce. Everything for human beings is scarce. Because it's not that we think that things are scarce, but that we think within a structure of scarcity. Our thoughts are limited by the very belief in scarcity. So I want you to begin to take a look. And I want you to get clear tonight for yourself, down inside yourself, down inside your structure of beliefs, that 15 million of us do not die each year as a consequence of starvation because food and agriculture are scarce. That's not true. 15 million people do not die in the space in which I live because food and agriculture are scarce. That's bullshit. As a matter of fact, just to demonstrate that fact, in this country alone, we feed more grain to cattle than it would take to feed all the hungry people in the world every year. Now, please don't misunderstand me. I'm not suggesting that we stop grain feeding our beef and that we start feeding that food, that same grain to people. I'm not suggesting that because I don't think that would work. But I am suggesting that you and I, in order to be able to examine the problem of hunger and starvation and get down to the laws about it, that we've got to start seeing that we've got this blindness, this screen in front of our eyes through which we look at everything called scarcity, and people don't die because food and agriculture are scarce. The second component in this structure of beliefs, this unconscious and unexamined structure of beliefs, this thing that you don't ever see, but out through which you look at the world, at hunger and starvation in particular, is the belief of inevitability. Human beings believe in inevitability. For instance, if I said, look, you can go through the rest of your life, never have another argument, you say, come on, Werner, stop. I mean, that's foolish. We know as long as they're human beings, there's going to be arguments. I mean, arguing is inevitable, isn't it? That's because we look at argument and we look at the rest of our lives and we look at the condition in which we live through this telescope called inevitability. I want you to know that hunger and starvation is not inevitable. God did not say, as long as there are human beings, there will be hunger and starvation. But I also want us to know, and I want us to be clear, that within our belief system it is like that. We say, well, gee, you have human beings, you know, you're going to have hunger and starvation. That's just the way it is. We all know that. You know, you get human beings together, some of them are going to starve to death. As a matter of fact, some of us know that if the people who starved to death, some of us know that if the people who starved to death didn't starve to death, the planet would be overcrowded with people. More bullshit. Hunger and starvation are in no way inevitable. They are not even close to being inevitable. There is nothing more natural than to feed the hungry, to feed yourself when you're hungry, to feed your family when your family members are hungry, to feed your neighbors when they're hungry. Nothing more natural. We heard a really very wonderful story. The president saw the film that I told you about earlier. And just at the end of the film, his daughter-in-law's baby began to cry. It was time to feed the baby, and she got up to go feed the baby. And the film ended, and the president said, it's very clear to me that nothing is more natural than to feed people who are hungry. He'd just seen it with his own eyes. Have you ever been to someone's home, a group of people perhaps, and one of the couples has an infant, and perhaps you're in the living room talking together and having fun, and the infant cries, the action stops instantly, and within yourself, it's not your child, but within yourself, something is unsettled as long as the child's crying in hunger. Something, you know, it's kind of, you know the feeling. You've all had the feeling. You've been around an infant who's crying in hunger. Man, there's something unsettled inside. There is nothing more natural. People don't die of starvation because they're lazy or ignorant or because starvation is inevitable. The third and most pernicious component of our unconscious and unexamined system of beliefs about hunger and starvation is this one. People starve because we don't have any solution to hunger and starvation. You see, there isn't a person in this room who would be willing to sit in here and listen to me if you could do something about the fact that every minute that you and I sit in here and talk together, every minute you and I sit in here and talk together, 21 children die as a consequence of starvation every minute you and I sit in here and talk together. And you know that if we could do something about it, we would have done it. If something could be done about it, we know our government would have done it. We know the experts and the professionals would have done it if there were solutions to the problem of hunger and starvation on the planet. If 21 children didn't have to die every minute, we would be doing something about it. There is no lack of solutions to the problem of the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet. 21 children do not die every minute because there are no solutions. That's bullshit. You've got to come up with something else. That ain't it. And man, that's a really difficult one to get out of your mind. You know it must be that we don't have a solution. I want you to know that you are perhaps clearer about hunger and starvation on the planet than most people have ever been. Because now you know who you are about hunger and starvation. Who you are is a mechanism which sees through a structure of scarcity, inevitability, and no solution. Now, once you get that about yourself, once you get clear about that, now you can start to be with the problem of hunger and starvation on the planet. You can be with the problem of the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet. You've begun to move out to the surface. And when you've cleared your own view up, and you don't have any opinion, and you're just observing the problem, you can begin to see that the problem is covered over with this very thick pea soup. That the problem is covered over with all these different opinions and this conflict and controversy. You get into a discussion about hunger and starvation with your friends and watch how fast the controversy comes up. Try it if you haven't. Start to talk about the problem and the solutions to hunger and starvation and watch how fast the controversy starts, the conflict starts, the opinions start. That's pea soup. What we want to do tonight is to examine the pea soup so as to get through it, so that we can look the facts, the truth about the persistence of hunger and starvation right in the face. So the pea soup gets made this way. Someone takes a position. Doesn't make any difference what the position is. Someone takes a position. And what they don't notice is that when you take a position, when you've got a position, it gives rise automatically, mechanically, and inevitably to the opposite position. You don't even have to do anything. And the opposite position is called into being instantly without your doing a thing. See, if I say left, I don't need to say right. Just by saying left, I have called right into existence automatically and mechanistically and inevitably. If I say up to you, I don't need to say down. If I say up, I establish down automatically. If I say I am taking the position to end hunger and starvation on the planet, I automatically and of necessity establish and create the opposite position, some form of opposite position. Perhaps it can't be done. Perhaps it's not worth doing. Whatever the form is, if I say, I am for the end of hunger and starvation on the planet, that's my position, to end hunger and starvation on the planet, I automatically and of necessity give rise to and create. I make the opposite position, the opposition in some form. Perhaps the form is it can't be done. Perhaps the form is it isn't worth doing. But any position automatically and inevitably calls up its opposite position. And that begins the pea soup. That starts the pot going. Now, to fill in the pot and get it nice and thick so that you can't even see down through it to the truth of hunger and starvation, so that all you're left with is this controversy and this conflict and opinionization, to get the soup nice and thick, what happens is that you have the nucleus of yes and no, the nucleus of position and opposite position or opposition, and then around that nucleus you begin to build a mass of other solutions. No, I got a better solution, a little bit more mass. But I got a different solution, a little bit more mass. But no, what we need to do is more, a little bit more mass. But no, I got a better on your better. You know that different solution you came up with? I got an even different one than your different one. You know, your idea was to do more. I want to do even more. And that's what makes up the pea soup. That pea soup of confusion and controversy, of conflict, of mistrust, of argument, of positionality, of opinionization, of evaluation and judgment, that is what makes up the pea soup that covers over every one of the major problems to making our world work. And certainly you can see it now that you've been through the presentation covering over the truth about the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet. We're now very close out here to the surface of the globe. See, we have kind of dropped our position about it. We aren't looking at it through the scarcity, inevitability, no solution screen. We've kind of begun to get under the pea soup, the controversy. You see, you begin to see that every new opinion only adds to the pea soup. You begin to see that any position you take about ending hunger only adds to the pea soup. And man, when I tell you, when you begin to see that no matter what position you take, it merely adds to the confusion, the conflict, the controversy, merely adds to this hopelessness and frustration. When you begin to see that, hope disappears. It goes away. There's no longer any hope. But it's interesting, because when hope disappears, so does hopelessness. So if you've now lost your hope, you've gotten underneath your hopelessness and frustration, and there you are. There's you, and there is hunger and starvation. You are now able to be with hunger and starvation, and to be with it directly. The confusion, the controversy, the doubt, the conflict, the arguments, you know, the positionality, the hopelessness and the frustration begins to part. And you begin to see hunger and starvation, the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet for what it really is. You can begin to see, because you are now out at the surface of the problem. At the surface of the problem, you can see that the source of the problem, the source of the persistence of hunger and starvation on this planet, are the forces on the planet. Given the forces on this planet, the result will be that each year hunger and starvation will persist. Now, I know that isn't clear yet. So listen to it again and I'll clarify it. What I'm saying is that hunger and when you clear away the hopelessness and the frustration, when you clear away your own unconscious and unexamined system of beliefs, when you get down underneath the pea soup, what you see is that hunger and starvation are a result of the forces on this planet. Now, you can divide you can talk about them as political forces. If you like politics, fine. You can talk about them as political forces. You don't like politics, use economic forces. You can say that the economic forces in this planet result in 15 million of us die each year. So you don't like economics? Use sociology. You don't like sociology? Use psychology. Use philosophy. Use any system, any discipline of forces you like. But as you get clear about hunger and starvation, as you get clear about the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet, you get clear that we've got hunger and starvation on the planet persisting because of the forces on the planet. And you can call them economic or political or sociological, psychological, anything you like, or any combination. But it gets to be very clear that what we do and what we don't do don't determine the persistence of starvation. It is the forces on the planet which result in the persistence of starvation. See, if the forces in a space are all lined up like this, you see? You've got the forces in a space all lined up like this. Everything's aligned like this, all the forces in this space. And you try to do something in that space that looks like this, you know what happens? If you try to do something in a space where all the forces are like this, you try to do something like this, what happens is this. Then you try harder, and what happens is that. Then you come up with a better idea about how to do it, and what happens is that. Then you find a different way to do it, and what happens is that. And anything you do looks like the forces. If this is what needs to be done to end hunger and starvation, and it is attempted in a set of forces that look like this, what this will come out to look like is this. It is not what we do or don't do, but the condition of unworkability in which we attempt to do it that keeps us from being able to end hunger and starvation on the planet. And we have now gotten to the laws by which the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet are governed, generated, and ruled. It's the fundamental condition in which we live, which is responsible for the persistence of hunger and starvation on the planet. And you and I are now on the surface of this globe, on the surface of this sphere, called the problem of the persistence of hunger and starvation and what to do about it. We've arrived at the beginning. We've gotten past our own unconsciousness, our own system of beliefs. We've gotten down underneath the pea soup, the confusion, the doubt, the controversy, the arguing, the opinionization, the evaluation and judging, and we've come face to face with the source of the problem of persistence of hunger and starvation. And what we see is that hunger and starvation persist on this planet because of the condition or forces on the planet. Now, the truth is that if we could have sat here tonight and talked back and forth and discussed this, we would have come up with all of that. It's true, it took me 3 years of sitting talking, but I was only talking to myself, you see. I had the help of 1 or 2 other people, but very few. Given all of us here tonight, we would have gotten it in a matter of hours. Within 10 hours, we would have certainly gotten to where we are now. Not bad. I mean, really incredible. Truly incredible. It's really an acknowledgement of who you are that I could even get away with saying that. Even hope that that might be true. And I'll tell you what, if we sat here for a while longer, somebody would put up their hand, and we would call on them, and in here we'd have to give them a microphone so they could be heard. And what they would say is, listen, I remember the Victor Hugo quote that all of the forces in the world are not so powerful as an idea whose time has come. Can you begin to feel the load that you felt when you were stuck in the problem start to lift? I can. I can actually feel it in the room. I can begin to feel people feeling like they've got a little room to move in. And in fact, when you notice that truly all of the forces in the world, these monstrous conditions, which are much larger than any one of you little insignificant people or this little insignificant person. These forces, these gigantic forces in the world, you know, these incredible forces, they are not so powerful as an idea whose time has come. You begin to see into the possibility of mastering those forces. Because let me tell you, and it's very, very simple. Very simple. Look, when the end of hunger and starvation on this planet's time comes, hunger and starvation on this planet will end. And it won't make any difference what we do or don't do. Because what we do will work. And we will do what works when the end of hunger and starvation on the planet's time comes. Because that's the way the universe in which you and I live works. You see, people say, oh no, but you need all of the facility. Well, certainly you need the facility. Don't be silly. I know if you lie on the ground and don't do anything, nothing happens. Do I look like a fool? I mean, how silly can people get? Certainly I recognize that you've got to do something. But that isn't the point. The point is that until its time comes, nothing you do will work. And when its time comes, what you do will work, and you will do what works. The scourge of smallpox, those of you who have traveled in Asia have seen a little bit of some of the evidence of the disfiguration of smallpox. Begins to represent the incredible problem smallpox was in Asia and in Africa. Most of us know, for all practical purposes, really for all practical purposes, smallpox has been eliminated. The scourge of smallpox has been eliminated on this planet. Traveled in Asia not too long ago, and there are signs on the wall in big red letters which say that there is a reward for anyone who will come to the clinic who has a fever and red spots. No one collects those rewards today because for all practical purposes, smallpox is eliminated. Now, everybody knows how you eliminate smallpox. What you do is you inject people. You give them a vaccine. I mean, that's how you eliminate smallpox. You vaccinate a large enough percentage of the population to control the spread of smallpox, and eventually you contain it, and eventually you narrow it down, and eventually you blot it out. And that's how you end smallpox on the planet. So all you need is the vaccine. The vaccine for smallpox was invented and perfected 150 years ago. The end of smallpox came 2 years ago. It was not the vaccine. It was not the absence of the vaccine which caused smallpox to persist. The persistence of smallpox on this planet was not a lack of the solutions to the problem. It was the forces in the world. Again, you can describe them as political forces. Countries who didn't want any help from the outside. You can describe them as economic forces. The money wasn't appropriated. You could define them as sociological forces. People didn't feel, people felt that, I don't know, that if the disease was natural, that we shouldn't go against God's will, who knows? Or maybe they're the psychological forces, I don't know. But the point that I'm trying to make, and what's so difficult for us to see, is that it was not the absence of the solutions to the end of smallpox that caused smallpox to persist. It was the forces in the world. And when the idea, the end of smallpox on this planet's time came, smallpox ended. Then what we did worked. Then we did what worked. You know, it's very interesting. Certainly you need the precursor technology. Certainly you need to have the ability to do. 2 months after we created the Hunger Project for you, your project, it was very interesting. A very synergetic thing happened. Obviously a coincidence, but never mind. The National Academy of Science published its findings on a very, very exhaustive 2-year study of the problems of the persistence of hunger and starvation. The headlines in the reports was, National Academy of Science says that hunger and starvation can be ended in 20 years. You know, the project was only a month or two old, so we know the project didn't have anything to do with it. Obviously. No one would argue to the contrary. But man, when there are going to be coincidences, I want them on my side. And what brings the coincidences onto your side is when this thing's time comes. It's very simple. I mean, really incredibly simple. You see, people think that Wilbur and Orville Wright invented the airplane. I promise you that Wilbur and Orville Wright would be listed as bicycle merchants today if flight's time had not come. Certainly they're to be congratulated because they experienced that its time had come and were willing to do what was necessary in fulfillment of that experience. But without the experience, without the idea's time coming, what needs to get done doesn't get done, and what you do doesn't work anyhow. Now, if we sat here for another couple of hours, no, it wouldn't take that long with you. If we sat here for another couple of minutes, if 4 or 5 people could stand up and say, well, listen, what I wanted to say about that, and look, I looked at this and I just realized that, and I used to think this, but I gave that up now and I'm a little clearer, and I now see, someone would stand up and say, yes. Well, then the real question is, what causes an idea's time to come? Because when you've got the answer, you see, when you've got the answer to what causes an idea's time to come, you have got the answer about what makes a contribution to the quality of life. When you know what makes an idea's time come, you know in what way you can make a difference in the world. You've discovered how to make an impact on the condition in which you live. So that's what we're going to spend the most important part of the evening. We have now gotten to the most important part of the evening. We are about to discuss that very principle, the mastery of which equals the end of hunger and starvation on the planet. What we're going to do for the rest of the evening, really, although it will take many forms, what we're going to do is we are going to bring within our grasp the ability to cause an idea's time to come. Now look, you've worked very, 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 very hard so far. This has been difficult. I know you've been sitting there saying to yourself, look, why doesn't he stop talking and tell me what he wants me to do? I'll do anything. Why doesn't he get to the point? Why does he keep repeating himself? He said unconscious, unexamined structure of beliefs 35 times. I counted it. I do that on purpose. So I know it's been very difficult up until now. Now it gets harder. And it gets harder because the answer to this question is not like ordinary information. It will require something of you that you and I are normally not organized to give each other. Really not even organized to give ourselves. This information can only be apprehended by being willing to be. So you and I, what we need to do is to just be together. And as I said, I'll act as a little bit of a guide, not a leader, because no one can lead anyone to this kind of information. I'm not going to deliver the information because no one can give this information to you. But we're going to be with the question, what causes an idea's time to come, and we're going to be with it in such a way that we get the answer. And the answer is that kind of information which you can't understand and you can know, which you can't figure out and you can get. The answer simply is that an idea's time comes when the idea is transformed. Now that doesn't mean much. So we're going to spend quite a few minutes here together looking into what exactly that does mean. I want you to know that the words I'm going to be saying are just a way of taking up the time, while the answer comes to you for yourself. First off, I'd like to give you a kind of a definition of transformation that will begin to let us see into this question, what causes an idea's time to come? The answer is, an idea's time comes when the idea is transformed. What transformation could be said to be is the evolution of evolution. Now, what does that mean? Well, very simply this. There are evolutionary spaces. For instance, water is an evolutionary space. It has limits, and it has a lot of opportunity for evolution in it. We're told that life began in water in a tropical tidal pool with a bit of protoplasm that with massive infusions of time, and time is one of the biggest factors in the equations of evolution. With massive infusions of time and the space in which to evolve, what happened to that little bit of protoplasm in the tropical tide pool is that it evolved out into a fish which could range from one end of a gigantic ocean to the other end of a gigantic ocean, even into the next ocean, and could go from the very surface of the sea to the very, very, very depths of the sea and not have any enemies in the sea, have no natural enemies. Now that's pretty good. You take a space and add time, and what you get is this incredible process called evolution. Very beautiful and wonderful things come out of it. And when you used up the evolutionary space, what evolution does is to turn back on itself. And it begins to produce weird variations, little specialties. You know, you're down here only on this island, only on the east side of this island, only under these kind of rocks do you find this kind of fish doing this kind of dance once every 20 years in order to propagate its species and survive. Now those weird variations look wonderful in tropical fish tanks. But essentially, once the evolutionary space is used up, evolution begins to turn back on itself. Now, every once in a while, even though the evolutionary space may be used up, evolution itself, the process which we label evolution, actually itself evolves. And it does not do so with time. It's kind of like transcendent. It happens almost instantly. One day a fish walks up onto land. And when the fish walks up onto land, a whole new evolutionary space has been created, in which now the infusion of time will use up that space beautifully. When the fish walks on land, that is the evolution of evolution, that is transformation. Now, the best example of that is animal to man. I'll let you use whatever theory in between there you like. You can use the biblical one, the Darwinian one. It doesn't make any difference. But the space called animal has a limit to it. Just as in the sea you don't evolve birds because it's inconsistent with the space of the sea. Just as within the scope animal, you do not evolve man. Animal has to transcend. Life must transcend the space, the evolutionary space animal, and create a new space called humankind, into which you can then feed time and produce incredible and beautiful evolution. So transformation is the evolution of evolution. Now what I said way back there 5 or 10 minutes ago was that an idea's time comes when that idea is transformed. Now I want to speak specifically about an idea. Transformation is the shift in the basis of something. Transformation is a shift in the basis of the very existence of something. Now watch, just stay with me. This one's difficult. When the basis for the existence of something is shifted from being dependent on something outside of itself to being self-sufficient, then that has been transformed. I'll say it again. When the existence of something, when the basis, listen, I know it's difficult. I know you didn't get it yet. I'm going to keep repeating it. You will get it. It's the magic powder. When the basis of the existence of something is shifted from being dependent on something outside of itself to being self-sufficient, then that is transformed. You see, a thing, listen, a thing, T-H-I-N-G, a thing, in order to exist, needs limits. It needs to stop someplace. It needs to not exist. You see this pencil? This pencil exists only as a function of its not existing around it. A thing, including an idea as a position. Listen, a thing, including an idea as a position, must have a specific identity. It must begin someplace, it must have a middle someplace, and it must end someplace. It's got to be somewhere in particular. Without boundaries, without limitations, a thing cannot, actually does not exist. So this thing, this pencil, and any idea as a position requires something outside of itself for its existence. It requires not itself. The pencil and an idea as a position must have not itself to exist. It's like it needs other positions. It needs other ideas in order to exist. It's kind of like left needs right in order to exist. Up needs down in order to exist. A thing has to exclude something. If it's everything, it has no specific identity, it's nothing. A thing which is nothing specific is nothing. A thing which is everything is nothing. So to be is to be something specific. To be is to be related to that which it is not. See, what you and I call emptiness is really a pencil, expanded in every direction infinitely. It has nothing to which it can relate. So, when an idea, watch, when an idea exists as a function of other ideas, when it exists in resistance to other ideas, listen, when an idea exists as a function of its resistance to other ideas, when an idea exists as a function of its opposition to the opposing idea, when an idea exists in relation to other ideas, that is an idea whose time has not come. An idea's time comes when the very existence of the idea, the very basis for the existence of the idea, is shifted from existing as a function of its resistance to the other ideas to being the context of all ideas. An idea's time comes when the idea ceases to exist as a content, as a position, and begins to exist as a context of all positions. An idea's time comes when it becomes the context for